So the paper I'm presenting is a project that's co-authored with Tamar Mitz and Yael Zaira, and it's really a work in progress, so I welcome questions and comments. It's a good time for those. So let me begin. There's a large literature in political science, international relations, and sociology that indicates that for nonviolent campaigns to be successful, so for protest movements to be successful in achieving their aims, they require, or at least it's very good that they have broad cross-cutting support. And in fact, this is considered one of the key advantages of nonviolent movements, unlike violent action, that they are considered to be more easily able to garner broad support, and this is associated with what's been found to be their greater success. And yet, we know, or we have reason to believe, that for ethnic minority movements, achieving this broad cross-cutting support is much more difficult. And this is for a number of reasons. So first, as you might guess, ethnic minorities typically have more limited access to influence, to resources, to power, etc. Also, if perceived in zero-sum terms, minority claims might be perceived to come at the expense of majority group claims, right? So anything you kind of cede to ethnic minorities is a ceding of privilege, and therefore potentially less likely to receive support. We also have some research that indicates that ethnic minority movements are likely to face more severe repression. This is not surprising. We have a lot of research from kind of criminal justice domains that suggest this, not as much when we look at protests, but it follows a similar logic. And then previous work that I've done there also shows that because there are widespread stereotypes, automatic stereotypes that associate ethnic minorities with violence, with criminality, and with threat, even when they're protesting peacefully or non-violently, they're perceived as more violent. That in itself reduces public support. So for all of these reasons, and we could probably think of more reasons, ethnic minority movements face structural barriers when trying to attract this broad-based support. So that's sort of the structural bind that I begin with and the motivation of this paper. And the question that we're trying to ask here in a broader sense is there any way out? So, okay, we know that all these obstacles exist. What do we do now? Especially when we know that in some cases, nonviolent campaigns by ethnic minorities have been remarkably successful. So this is probabilistic, it's not deterministic, and potentially we could identify channels that could increase public support for ethnic minority movements. And so in this paper, and you know, there's several channels that one can think of, but in this paper, we look at one particular one that might potentially expand mobilization, the participation of majority group allies. So you're probably familiar with this term. Allies are committed participants from majority groups that put themselves out there, put their bodies out there alongside minorities in advocating or fighting for minority causes. So can allies address these structural challenges that or barriers that I listed a minute ago and therefore increase public support? However, I also want to ask at the same time whether this comes at a cost. And I'll detail this in a bit, but it could be that even if there are positive, or I guess if anybody here has had, you know, an activist history, you might know that allies, while potentially bringing positive impact, can also be frustrating, annoying, you know. Think of kind of, this might meet you at various places, identities in your life. And so potentially this could have a cost for core constituencies, right, for minority groups. Okay, so that's the question. There's very little direct research on this question, on how allies affect broader public opinion. There is related work, primarily in social psychology, that asks why people become allies. So why do majority group members go out and become advocates for minority groups, and social movements literature that looks at coalitions of various organizations that come together in pursuit of a particular cause, but a lot less work that looks at the effects of allies, specifically on public opinion. What we do have is historical work and case studies of various minority movements, and these highlight, as I've just noted, a tension between potential positive impact of allies and then the potential cost. So if we look at the benefits for a minute, on the one hand, majority group allies might help confront structural obstacles faced by minorities in a number of ways. So it's sort of the mirror image, right? The flip side of what I just said. They bring more access to resources, to power. There's also work that suggests that people are persuaded more easily by their co-ethnics. So they might just serve as persuaders, role modelers, etc. Some theoretical work, I haven't really seen empirical work on this, but theoretical work in social psychology that suggests that majority allies might foster hope and empowerment among minority groups. They might also potentially counteract negative stereotypes, automatic stereotypes that are triggered, or associated with ethnic minorities. Potentially, allies can counteract these. And then finally, they might raise the cost of repression. So either reduce aggressive policing and repression, or at least if such repression occurs, drawing attention to it, right, and more condemnation of it. So that's on the benefit side. On the other hand, we might have, as I said before, we might have some costs. We know the history of majority participation in ethnic minority movements is fraught. This is a really nice article from the early 70s that compares the abolition movement, anti-slavery movement, civil rights movement, and then the movement to abolish untouchability in India. And it shows, looking at those various activist movements in which we had both kind of core constituents and allies, that there are often tensions, either over ideology or not either, one, over ideology. Core activists sometimes have more radical views and allies kind of push for more moderate views. Allies are sometimes perceived as less committed because they have more exit options, right? They can decide the next day that they're out. And then finally, relationships between activists in the movement can also reflect broader power relations. And that might lead to alienation of core members because of these sort of reproduction of power relations outside the movement into the movement. Now, I should say that this work discusses tension among activists. So minority and majority activists, and not public opinion. But it's plausible that these are reflected in public opinion or that they spill over into public opinion. So we're kind of drawing the implications from here. And then perhaps especially we might see costs when allies take a leadership role, right? So if allies are putting themselves out there in this kind of central position, we might expect the negative effects to be greater. So these are the two sides of or the two sets of implications: positive effect of allies on public opinion on the one hand, potential costs for core constituencies on the other. And let me jump to the research design. And the context that we conducted our study in is Black Lives Matter, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with, movement that since 2013 has been organizing to protest police violence and racial injustice. And as you probably all remember, in the summer of 2020, this huge wave of protests across the United States, what became the largest and also the broadest, so most diverse protest movement in US history. And these protests were notable for considerable white participation. So this was one of the key features of these protests, that whites came out to protest, even in areas that had never protested before, where no Black people lived, right, kind of small town America. And this was something that was discussed extensively at the time. Some people saw this as very hopeful, and some people perhaps building on kind of difficult experience, reacted with more skepticism. So this is the context. And we did 3 different things, and I'll try to run through them as quickly as possible because there's a lot going on. We conducted a survey experiment in the United States where I'll show you in a moment, but we essentially manipulated the share of white participants in a hypothetical protest. We also did some automated analysis of user engagement with real-time protest imagery on Twitter. And then we qualitatively analyzed open text survey responses to give some more, depth and nuance and complexity to our responses. So let me begin with the experiment. So we fielded a survey about a year ago in the United States where we manipulated the composition of a fictitious or a hypothetical protester group for 4 conditions. And you can see the vignette here. Essentially, it's sort of a generic racial justice protest. So racial justice, against police brutality. We have 4 conditions: an all Black condition, majority Black condition, majority white, and all white. So you can see we're manipulating the share of whites, and we signaled racial composition in a number of ways. We noted it explicitly. We used distinctive names, which is kind of typical in work on race and ethnicity. And then we used images to convey the information visually. And kind of real quick on the images, what we did here to preserve experimental validity was we took a base image of a protest, and then we started playing with it. So the faces you see here are artificially generated. They're not real, because what we wanted to do was isolate race and keep the other features constant, like gender. Is that a question?
Did you get a approval?
Yes. Yes, we did, and it was not easy, but we could discuss it later. Of course, at 3 different institutions, I should know. So these are fake faces. Subjects were debriefed. And then we worked with a graphic designer to work with like the lighting and the angles, because the technology is still not 100%. I can kind of tell you, disclose off record, that if you take the masks off, they look really super fake. But with the masks on, I think it, especially if you're like an online survey participant, you're not spending 10 minutes trying to deconstruct this photo. Okay, so what did we do? We asked about 6 outcomes, and you have the little arrow indicates our expectations. So this is assuming everything is positive, right? So if the impact is positive, we expect people to perceive the protest as less violent. This is building on our earlier work. We also expect them to assess the likelihood of police use of force as lower, to express less support for large-scale police presence, more approval for the protest, to report the higher likelihood of participation in such protests, and also a higher feeling of safety at attending a protest like this. So these are the outcomes we examine. And, these are, I'm not gonna, this is just for illustrative purposes, but I'll kind of run through the main findings. What we find is consistent with the positive expectation. So moving from an all-black protest to a majority white protest decreases perception of protester violence by 14%. Remember, these are protests are identical, the language is identical. The manipulations are fairly subtle. Reduces expectations of police use of force and support for policing, and increases approval of protests by around 9%. So these effects are small but well identified, and for a survey experiment with kind of these soft manipulations, it's not bad. Yeah.
Clarify question.
Yeah.
When you say about, are you eliciting their perception about that specific protest?
Yes.
Or not like BLM protests?
Yeah, good question. No, we're eliciting, so it's not like a prime and then we're asking them about other things, but we're asking them about the vignette that they just read.
Okay.
Yeah.
Not necessarily prime, it could just be that you update.
Yeah, okay, yeah, fair enough. That's right. Okay, I noted that before that we had potentially conflicting expectations for majority respondents and minority respondents, right? And so we purposely oversampled Black respondents so that we could have power to examine these expectations. And what we find is, as one might expect or not, I don't know, is that results are largely driven by white respondents. So everything I just described reflects white responses. We don't see much of an effect of allies on Black respondents. So they tend to be supportive of these protests regardless of how many white people are there. But interestingly, though, we don't see any backlash effect. So if we thought that people would feel more alienated, less likely to participate, less safe, etc., we don't see any of that. Okay, I actually forgot to set my timer. So can I get a quick cut?
Yes, you have 13 minutes.
Oh, okay. All right, so can go through this. Great. So, okay, survey experiments are no, that didn't make sense to me either.
More like sorry.
Hey, okay, that's not bad. I'll update. Okay. Yeah, good. Thank you. No, it's good. Okay. So survey experiments are great for what they can give us, but they have well-known limitations. And I, at least, and I'm sure many of you always have an impulse to ask, okay, well, what about the real world, right? So what can we get? Can we get anything from real observational data that can provide some support for these findings? So what we did is as follows. We used Twitter's academic research API to download all image-containing tweets with Black Lives Matter or BLM hashtags from June and July 2020. So this is all the tweets with these hashtags in these months. And then using crowd counting consortium data, which is, it is what it sounds like. They basically count protests. We selected the largest ones, or we chose the threshold of 3,000 plus participants, and then we filtered tweets to those dates. So what we have at this point is close to 3 million tweets, around 1 million images, and the reason why there are more tweets than images is because a lot of images are shared again and again, right? And then what we do is 2 things. First, to identify protest imagery, because these could be images of anything, selfies, and we want images of protest. We use a deep learning image classifier that was developed by Steiner, Threlkeld, and others. We validate this. I won't go into it, but it actually worked very well on our data as well, even though this was developed a number of years ago. So that minimizes our sample somewhat. And then we use another algorithm, a face detection tool, to classify images based on racial identity. So we can know, this is Kairos API, we can know in each image what % is white, what % is Black, what % is Asian, etc. Obviously, not all images can pass these tests. Some are blurry, some are, distant. So ultimately, we have a data set of 52,000 images shared in around 300,000 tweets. And now what we're interested in finding out is whether, when there are more white people in tweets, do they get more amplification on Twitter? That's what we're going to be checking. The way we do this is we create an allies variable by measuring the average value of white protesters detected in the image. This goes from 0, which is all black, to 1, which is all white. And again, this is just a random sample of photos with these values. Just to have an idea of what the distribution of our data set is, it's bimodal, so most photos had either only black or only white, and then kind of uniform in the middle. And what we find is that images with majority white people receive more engagement on every metric. So more likes, more quotes, more replies, and more than twice as many retweets. So there's a lot of a lot more amplification to white majority images. That's when we kind of look at a binary variable: white majority, black majority. Here, we're looking not only at the number or the level of engagement, but also at its tone, positive or negative. And we do this using both sentiment analysis, which is kind of the traditional way. We also, those of you on Twitter know this concept of a ratio. So if your tweet is ratioed, and I have a debate with my teenage son over what a ratio is, and he doesn't like it. So, but essentially it means that your responses are more popular than your tweet, really. And that means people are piling on. So we say, okay, what if we take the inverse of this measure? And you're actually getting a lot more likes and a lot less responses. That should maybe be an indication of more positive sentiment. So regardless of how we measure kind of positive tone, we find a significant association between an increasing number of white protesters in the image and positive sentiment. So not just quantity, but also quality. And here's just a sample of images that were scored in a very positive way. And you can see that these tend to be majority white. Okay. 3 minutes. All right. So I'll take 2 more minutes to finish the research design. The last thing we did was we explored potential mechanisms. So once we collected all our outcome data, we concluded our survey with 2 exploratory questions. We asked respondents, how much do you agree with these 2 statements on a scale of 0 to 100? White participants help advance the goals of the movement. White participants cause more problems than they solve. This is exploratory. There's obviously various biases that can go into this, social desirability. I'm not shying away from any of that. All of it's true. You can see, again, with these caveats, that the positive statement, number 1, receives more support on average. And interestingly, especially from Black respondents. So I think it's around 66% that expressed, or Black people on average express a level of 66% of support for this statement. Responses are more uniform for the negative statement, around 40%. And obviously I can't go into this here. I'll just say that we then qualitatively analyzed, or after we asked about those 2 statements, we said to people, can you in a couple of sentences explain your response? And then we analyzed these in a qualitative way. And you can, if you're sitting close enough, you can see some of the themes. But to just summarize real quick, we do find some differences between how Black and white respondents think about allies. So when you look at positive statements, Black respondents' answers tend to highlight instrumental motivation. So why are allies great? Because government power holders are white, so more effective. Because whites add more credibility, legitimacy to the movement, etc. Whereas white respondents are more likely to discuss to think about allyship in intrinsically important ways, more solidarity, it's the right thing to do, everybody has the right to protest, etc. And when we look at negative themes, we also find some differences. We find that Black respondents are more concerned about the trustworthiness of allies, predicting that they're actually going to incite violence, worrying that their activism is more performative and attention-seeking, whereas white respondents are more likely to say things like, whites should stay in their lanes, Black people don't want them there, which ironically is actually probably not true, but those are the kind of responses that we find. All right, so to summarize, what we find here is that sizable majority participation in minority protests has a significant positive effect on public opinion. It reduces perceptions of protester violence and support for protest policing. It increases approval of and likelihood of participation in such protests. We also find consistent with this that images of protests containing more majority participants receive more engagement, and that engagement is more likely to be positive in both content and in tone. While these results are driven by majority respondents, we do not find a backlash effect among minorities, so that suggests that activists and the broader public respond differently to allies. So if you remember, I said potentially minority activists are the ones that are getting aggravated by majority activists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that public opinion is reacting in the same way, and that's actually consistent with some work on the civil rights movement, where we know that white participation was very popular among broader Black audiences. So overall, our findings suggest that sizable participation of allies can be a powerful tool for counteracting structural obstacles to ethnic minority protests. And for activists, this suggests that efforts to work with allies, though I recognize, or we could recognize, that they're potentially fraught and they require care and awareness, can reap substantial rewards, at least in the domain of public opinion. So that's kind of something to keep in mind as one works through these issues. That's it. Thank you very much.